Aurora Brown and intersectional psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Hello and welcome back to Intersectional Psychology. Today we are covering the second half of my interview with Neesha Chhiba, in which we discuss trauma-informed counselling with children. Enjoy! Some people might say that apartheid has been over for 30 years, and with the advent of cell phones, the internet, and globalization, children across South Africa and around the world are growing up with a more monolithic culture, a common set of references and values and interests. How would you respond to that?
Honestly, this really reminds me of this powerful speech that was delivered by Charlie Chaplin all the way back in 1940, which is 80 years ago. I wonder if we can't play it.
You, the people, have the power to create machines, the power to create happiness. You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite. Let us fight for a new world, a decent world that will give men a chance to work, that will give youth a future and old age a security. By the promise of these things, brutes have risen to power, but they lie. They do not fulfill that promise. They never will. Dictators free themselves, but they enslave the people. Now let us fight to fulfill that promise. Let us fight to free the world, to do away with national barriers, to do away with greed, with hate and intolerance. Let us fight for a world of reason, a world where science and progress will lead to all men's happiness. Soldiers, in the name of democracy, let us all unite!
So, in this Charlie Chaplin speech, at that time, technology wasn't where it is today. And yet, if we consider what they were facing at the time, I feel that as human beings, we are still looking for freedom. We're still looking for what democracy really promised, which was this ability to be free thinking and to not be persecuted for, freedom of speech. And so while the formal system of apartheid may be behind us, the world continues to grapple with issues like greedy leadership, systemic social discrimination on just any aspect of our stratification, whether that's race, gender, any sort of part of that class even. So those imbalanced power structures that manifest in ways that are unique to our time, it's absolutely insane. So these challenges really highlight how far we still have to go in terms of upholding basic human values. I think throughout time, we seem to really not quite have it down in terms of how do we respect everyone and give them equally human dignity and respect that. And as a community, as a government, on an individual basis, how can we be more respectful to those aspects? So I strongly believe that every individual is entitled to dignity, respect, and equal opportunity. And if we can come together, whether we create a culture or as a community, around those shared values, collective interests, and a common respect for humanity and the planet, then perhaps we can do more to build a sustainable future and to just respect our space. So I feel that unity doesn't necessarily require uniformity. It requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to challenge systems that prioritize profit or control over people on the planet, which sadly is really reflected in today's climate. And furthermore, I feel that education plays a vital role in this transformation. So teaching children and teenagers and even just young adults that ability to have that discernment, to have those critical thinking skills in schools is so essential. So that young people can develop the ability to question, to analyze and make informed decisions about what's going on around them, rather than becoming, sort of passive recipient for biased information and propaganda. Because as you can see, with the way social media has changed over time, it seems like we're being swayed either way in the face of distraction. So only by empowering the next generation to think for themselves can we hope to foster a society built on truth, justice, and compassion is honestly, I feel, the best way forward.
Charlie Chaplin's speech was very inspiring, but I think you raised it to a whole nother level by saying unity doesn't require uniformity. Is that a quote from somewhere, or is it a Neesha copyright?
Yeah, but I actually had to really look at the research, to be honest with you. A lot of the research had these key terms that were constantly featuring in terms of where we were falling short. And so I really just put that all together in terms of buzzwords and in terms of thinking of it that way.
Well, honestly, if I ever create podcast merch, I'm going to ask you to give me that phrase. I'll quote you, and people all over South Africa will be walking around with the name Registered Counsellor Neesha Chhiba across their chests. Okay, but now back to that very relevant clip you shared. It's extremely chilling to hear Chaplin's 85-year-old speech at this point in time. When his film The Great Dictator, which this clip is from, was released in 1940, the world was busy resisting the fascist Nazi party in Germany and trying to stop its genocidal, anti-Semitic Holocaust project. But right now, it seems that fascism is spreading even further than ever before, with basic human rights being stripped away from marginalized people in countries like the US, the UK, Russia, Hungary, and throughout Africa. And the sad thing is, many of these countries were part of the Allied forces opposing the Nazis. And not to mention the genocides currently being committed in Palestine, Sudan, and Burma, with barely anyone else in the world willing to lift a finger to stop them. Raising children to build a society founded on truth, justice, and compassion seems more and more challenging. But we've established that culture does matter, and unity doesn't require uniformity. And I think also our differences make us stronger. Having such a rich diversity of cultures in South Africa could really enable us to become even more of a leader on the global stage if we can actually start working together. I suppose this government of national unity is a start. Working with trauma is complex and challenging, and there are specific considerations in trauma care when working with children. How do you translate the principles of trauma-informed counselling to child and play counselling?
That is almost a 10-step question or spectrum of looking at things, because there are so many things that go into this mixing pot of how did we get here? And I think everything starts with developmental stages. As you and maybe some of the viewers can look into this, that for each period of life, we have developmental stages. And at these developmental stages, for example, the earliest one that's often something people struggle with late in life is the stage of trust versus mistrust. Predominantly in the early years of your life, within the first few years, your caregivers are mainly how you are learning this attachment style of, can I trust you to take care of me? Will you feed me? Will you offer me safety and security? Often if that's not taken care of in that early stage, it comes out in later stages of life in terms of how we interact with other people. That being said, though, I feel that we often boomerang to different points back. We're constantly in the state of needing to resolve various aspects of these developmental stages until we reach, this amazing point of self-actualizing. And, even then you can bounce up and down between these developmental stages. But the essential part that I want to get across is creating that safety and stability for children. So there's a lot of pushback, I believe, at the moment around rules and routine, but the research has shown that routine and rules, when taken into consideration your child's context, so without going to the extreme, really is meant to create stability. Knowing, for example, that every day, supper's at 8 o'clock, we're in bed by 8:30, creates that certainty. You're less anxious. Whereas a lot of children in South Africa, they don't know when their next meal is, and the impact that it has on them is incredible. So those aspects of safety and having basic human needs cared for and taken care of is such a big aspect. I mentioned attachment and relationships earlier. So, knowing that you could trust your caregiver or your parent in those early stages of life has such big implications for people on their friendships and even romantic relationships, more significantly in terms of how they resolve conflict or how they view conflict or how they look at being with someone. And considering that no man is an island, as that famous expression goes, we need to learn how to be with people and how to be comfortable within ourselves in that same sense. And then another aspect that makes working with trauma complex and challenging is communication barriers. Often, as I mentioned, you may not be able to find someone in your area to, see a child with these language barriers. And you have to find a way to communicate and to offer them assistance. So often I will work with pictures and be like, how do you feel today? It's a sad face or a smiley face. And tell me, what are you feeling? Let's use pictures to communicate. So that's a big aspect. And even with language, some children are quite nonverbal. So they rely on a lot of nonverbal cues as a self-defense mechanism as well, to just prevent, because often if they say something in certain communities and in certain households, they'd get hit or they'd face other forms of abuse and neglect. So working with children in those aspects also requires a certain amount of care. And then I mentioned this earlier, but really involving caregivers, helping them understand what the child's needs are and helping them work towards freedom of expression is a big aspect. And then avoiding re-traumatization is a very, very big one. So often when we're trying to understand something that the child is facing, having them explain something so many times to every other person who has asked them is just it's re-traumatizing them. And so we have to find a different way of addressing issues at times. It's one of the reasons why I like the brainwork recursive therapy, because it works with children and it does in such a way that we don't actually have to, re-traumatize our clients. We don't have to ask them to, sort of go and re-explain things. We just ask them to work with that memory or with that feeling, which is great. And then cultural context and sensitivity. I mentioned earlier that having sometimes a culture or a community not having a language around mental health difficulties often means that the expression for those difficulties is quite suppressed or subdued. And so understanding and being creative and finding different ways to engage with them is such an important aspect. And then a lot of the work that we do as registered counselors is building resilience. And I think you could go about that in almost 101 ways if you really wanted to, but it's such a big aspect to managing any mental health condition is to really get that step forward. You need to build resilience. So that's such a big factor.
It's me, Aurora. Please excuse me interrupting my own podcast. I'm just here to say that I will never include third-party ads on intersectional psychology, which is great because it means that you can be sure all the mental health information and content shared here is free from corporate influence and bias. However, it also means that this podcast will only be made possible by support from you, the listener. So if you enjoy this podcast or find value in it, please consider joining my Patreon, or Matreon rather, for as little as $3 per month. Your contributions will be used to improve this podcast, to cover the production costs to research, write, record, and edit each episode, and to host our guests. In return, you'll get exclusive Matreon benefits like bonus episodes, additional guided mindfulness recordings, early access to new episodes, extended episodes and outtakes, group discussions, and more. So just go to patreon.com and search for intersectional psychology. Thanks, and back to intersectional psychology.
And then I would say long-term monitoring. So really making sure that you're following up, whether your client is seeing a GP or is working with a psychiatrist and other mental health practitioners, really following up, checking in every once in a while. Are they fine? Have they developed? Do they need more assistance? And working with your community. So that interdisciplinary collaboration is also quite important.
We've covered such a range of considerations requiring empathy and awareness when working with children. Going back to what you were saying about developmental stages, sometimes we have to go back and solve the problem of a previous phase before we can address what's happening in the current phase of development. And I think that's another way that decolonizing mental health can evolve the theories that we learned. Healing isn't a straight line, and those developmental stages we learned at college can happen in cycles. You also mentioned building resilience. People still don't seem to think about mental health the way that they think about physical health. We all have physical health, we all have mental health, but what state is that health in? Just like with physical health, where we have to eat healthily and exercise, we also have to take care of our mental health on an ongoing basis so that we can maintain good mental health for longer. Even when you're not in the middle of a crisis, good mental health practices can help to prevent you being pushed into a crisis the next time something dysregulating happens. So building that resilience is part of like your mental health muscles, and something that children should be learning from a very young age. But I guess one of the challenges in working with kids is that they are even more influenced by the systems that they move in and the other people in their lives than adults are. So it's super important to involve the caregivers in the work that we do with the kids so that they can also support a child's healing at home between sessions. How would you advise parents, grandparents, and other caregivers to support the mental health of their children and help them to heal from trauma?
I would recommend a few things. And I feel that probably a lot of you are already doing this already. So if this only just builds on that, then that's amazing. So providing that safe, stable environment and routine as far as humanly possible, and having conversations with your child about safety and what that means in their environment is so important for them to understand and to navigate their space better. And just also actively listening, and being emotionally available. When your child says something, don't emotionally check out and go, oh, they're blaming me for X, Y, Z. So also looking at it from a non-judgmental space and just really allowing them to vent and to share their views. And if they ask you for how to manage this, then offer, but try not to insert yourself too much into their context. So a great way to do this is by using open-ended questions instead of closing statements to their responses. So validating their feelings and not dismissing them. So for example, not going, oh, but XYZ's child isn't like this, or they don't do this, so what's going on here? So really understanding that everyone is unique, everyone is on their own journey, and that your child may need, they may need to have their own views and visions for their future respected. And to find out how to do that in a sensitive way is really important. And significant, whether, it's making jokes, if that's your language with your child, and that's also important. And then just looking out for any significant changes in behavior is a really big aspect. For example, especially with young children, things like biting, bedwetting, those sort of aspects are really important to look into understanding what is going on. Because, as I mentioned earlier, there's such a big relationship between, even as you mentioned, the mind and the body, and that they're always connected. So the one will always have an interplay on the other. And then this one may be a bit tricky, especially when it comes to use of language around children, but being a role model for healthy coping skills. So that is such a big aspect. So instead of, flicking or swearing when you face a difficult situation, changing your language to go, well, what can I do to really improve the situation? And to sort of soften that, that initial tumble down on the hamster wheel that we all tend to fall on. So being that role model for healthy coping skills, and then seeking professional help if you need it, letting your child know that it's okay to see someone for help. And that if this is what they need, then we need to go to the right people for the right things. If we go to the doctor because, we're sick, or we go to a surgeon because we've broken our leg or something significant, then we need to know who to go to and how to get help. And then also empowering them and avoiding that re-traumatization, as I mentioned earlier. And really that requires sort of something that I mentioned earlier, which is the active listening and being emotionally available. And then the big one, which I know I'm going to get a lot of ahs and oh no about, is take care of yourself. And I know many adults who are listening to this are going, we always neglect that self-care, or self-care is such a buzzword. What is that? But really taking care of yourself, making sure that you're eating enough, you're getting enough sleep, and that you're actually able to be there for yourself, for your family, and for your work in a healthy and productive way is so essential.
Yeah, I feel a little called out by that last one, because it also comes down to trying to be a role model with healthy coping skills. You know, I have a 3-year-old niece, and the other day I was feeling down and I didn't have the bandwidth to cope with her energy. So she came to me and she wanted to play, but she noticed that I wasn't being as responsive as I usually am. So she said to me, "Why do you look sad?" And in the back of my mind, I was thinking like, holy shit, you're 3 years old and you're recognizing this and calling it out. But I responded in the typical social way, saying, no, I'm fine. I'll come and play with you a bit later. It's all good. And afterwards, I did go and play with her, but I wasn't fully engaged because I was sad. And I suddenly thought about how it might feel for her if I'm playing with her, but with the vibe of not really wanting to be there right then. You know, kids are so perceptive and intuitive. And I had to stop myself and I said to her, you know, you were right. I am sad, but it's not because of you, it's because of work. And it enabled us to talk about it and have that teaching moment of, you know, talking about our feelings and holding difficult feelings. So taking care of yourself is a part of taking care of the young people in your life. You know, there's that old cliche of putting your own oxygen mask on first. But it's a cliche for a reason. We can't be the caregivers we want to be if we are not taking care of ourselves, or if we are teaching unhealthy emotional regulation and ineffective coping strategies. Now, you also mentioned the importance of having a stable environment that provides routine, as well as the current pushback to routine. I agree with you. I can see how important it is for my niece to have a routine, that sense of safety and security that it gives her, and how when her routine is disrupted, she actually tries to enforce it and get us to behave in the ways that we usually behave and do things in the same order in which we usually do them. And yet, as you say, some people are advocating a move away from these rigid routines to not having any routine at all. And I think the reality is somewhere in the middle. You know, having a routine is important, but not every child needs to have the same routine. As you've said, every child is different. So it's appropriate for each child to have their own routine. What works for one child might not work for the next. But that doesn't mean that one child needs structure and the other one doesn't. It just means that each child needs different forms of structure and boundaries and safety and security. What are some of the trauma-informed approaches to self-care that you recommend for listeners to manage their own mental health so that they can put on their own oxygen masks first?
Absolutely. So to preface everything that I'm saying for the segment is that mental health and practicing good mental health habits is not something that you'll find in 1 or 2 sessions or a few sessions. It's got to be something that you're practicing constantly, whether you're going for therapy or counseling or just you're on a self-help journey. So being gentle on yourself and finding out what your safe space is as an adult. A lot of the times adults are going back to habits and spaces that may have served them well as children, but as adults no longer serve them anymore. So understanding as an adult, what is your safe space? Who are your safe people? And surrounding yourself with a supportive network to really insulate you from life's hardships. So if you think of yourself as sort of a wire insulated by a cable, it's that, sometimes you're going through something, sometimes your environment is going through something, and you need to have your people to really just insulate you. So finding that good support system and maybe even exploring that if you haven't found that yet. Sometimes you have to go through also a process of decluttering if you feel like that's what you need at this point in your life. So finding that tool or technique that works for you to manage stress doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional approach. You could be creative about it, whether that's having 10 minutes of silence in the morning before you go to work, or that cup of coffee before you get out of the car, finding that thing that really helps you manage your stress. And then boundaries and practicing non-judgmentalism, which is also a really big aspect, I would say, for listeners to work through. Because a lot of the time with boundaries, it's so hard to really keep them up. The minute we put one up, you immediately get pushback. People around you are like, why do I have to do this? Why do I have to conform to that? Why must I do this all of a sudden? And accepting that it's okay for them to push back, but your role is to reinforce your own boundaries, not to explain away or, to try and validate sometimes that little inner voice in your head that makes you feel guilt about putting up that boundary. So that's a big part of it. And that all stems from having a really good sense of non-judgmentalism. And then seek professional help when you're ready for it or when you need it. And really know that the professionals out there are really here for you and are ready to offer you that safe and non-judgmental space. They really are there to offer you that unconditional positive regard and authenticity, and they want to help you on your authentic journey is a big aspect.
Yes, I think we as adults also need good role models. And sometimes having someone in your life set a boundary can remind you that it's also good and healthy for you to set boundaries. Like, this is a note to self, because I do have a habit of overcommitting. We're all works in progress. Now, Neesha, is there anything you came to say that you didn't get to say?
I think if there's only one thing you have to take from everything that I've said so far, it would be this. Our boundaries and values can act as a compass in tangles of life if you can define them.
I love that. What a beautiful... Thank you. I love that. And where can listeners go to find out more about you and your work?
So I have an Instagram page called neeshachhibarc Counselling, but also encourage listeners to reach out at 082-326-9615 or to neeshachhibarc@gmail.com. Perhaps you can leave that as a note in one of the sections.
Neesha, thank you so much for being here, for your time and your energy. I appreciate you, and I appreciate all you listeners as well. Take care. Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectionalpsychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsy.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at Intersectional Psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Sight Black Women Praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health